Thank you. It's a treat to introduce Jim Loeffler. He's an associate professor of history and Jewish studies at the University of Virginia. He's a pianist, a musicologist, and a specialist on Jewish music. He received his PhD at Columbia University and has been a distinguished fellow at the Holocaust Memorial, the Library of Congress, and the Georgetown Law School, and has won many fellowships and awards. He's author of The Most Musical Nation, Jews and Culture in the Late Russian Empire, Yale University Press. And in progress, he is working on Rooted Cosmopolitans, Human Rights and Jewish Politics in the 20th Century. He's also working on a history of Zionism. He has written dozens of academic studies, book chapters, and more popular articles. He serves as not only a preeminent scholar, but a public intellectual, where he is simultaneously authoritative and provocative. He has for 10 years been curating concerts with Pro Musica Hebraica Foundation at the Kennedy Center in Washington. He founded the Jewish Music Forum, the main national venue for scholarly work on Jewish music. His recent writings include major studies of Chopin and Polish-Jewish musical relations, the Holocaust in Soviet art music, and a book in progress with the Israeli scholar Edwin Sarusi, reassessing the life and legacy of Avraham Tzvi Edelson, the most important 20th century figure in Jewish music. This afternoon, he will speak on how not to perform lost Jewish music. Please give him a nice welcome.
Thank you very much, Mike, for the very kind and gracious introduction, and I'll try to be provocative, live up to the billing. But I also thank you to Meister Conlon and Bob and the whole project for bringing us here together. It's a great, right before I came on, I was trying to make a slight change to my paper because we're in such a stimulating, ongoing, and developing conversation here in a nice way, and I think what I'll have to say will follow the wonderful talks we heard this morning in different ways, and really dovetail nicely also with what we just heard from Simon, who was also very provocative and very probing. So my topic is music, but I'm going to begin with literature, specifically with Franz Kafka. Kafka's an odd choice because he famously described himself as totally unmusical. He told his friend Max Brod that he couldn't tell the difference between The Merry Widow of Franz Lehár and Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. Brod dragged him to Prague for the premiere of Mahler's Seventh, with Mahler conducting, and he reacted by saying, I don't get it, essentially. It was too complicated for him. He told Brod that I can't remember any musical tunes, even ones I like, because I just have no memory for it. And then he also famously described music as leaving him feeling trapped and boxed in. So he could hardly seem less appropriate for thinking about music and the past. But of course, things are not always what they seem, and he's also a very musical writer, as many of you probably know. And I think he has something very specific to tell us about music, but also about music and the theme I'm particularly interested in tonight, this afternoon, which is loss. So there's a story about Kafka, not by Kafka, but about Kafka. And the story is that one day he was walking in a park in Berlin when he came across a little girl who was crying because she'd lost her doll. Kafka took it upon himself to stop and console this little girl, and he said to her, "Your doll's not lost, she's just away. I've just received a letter from her. She's gone on a great adventure around the world." And the little girl said, like any little girl would say, "I don't believe you. Who are you, strange man? I don't believe you, and if so, where's the letter?" And Kafka replied, this is a true story, by the way. Kafka replied, "Oh, well, the letter's, it's at home. I'll send it to you tomorrow." And for the next 3 weeks, Kafka wrote a letter every day to this little girl in the voice of the doll, describing her life's adventures. Finally, when he could keep it up no longer, he brought the girl a new doll and gave it to her and said, "Your doll is back." And the little girl said, as she would, "That's not my doll." And Kafka said, "Yes, it is." He insisted it is. She's absolutely the same. It's just that she's changed in her appearance because of all of her adventures around the world. So I like this story because it tells us something about loss and recovery. And it also tells us something about our motivations, right? I think we've heard a lot in our conference thus far about ethical and aesthetic dilemmas that attend our approaches to the troubled musical past. And what I want to look at in this talk is the questions about our motivations when it comes to loss and memory. What I mean by that is not merely how we approach and handle the past, but why we do so. What motivates us, and what does the past serve for us in the present? What needs does it serve today? For some time now, I've been involved in the scholarly study of Jewish music, and like many people here, I've also been involved in the other side of it, curating it, programming it, presenting it, performing it for audiences. And my experience has been broad in that respect. You know, I've worked with Hasidic nigunim, wordless melodies from archives in Eastern Europe and brought them to Jewish communities in Jerusalem and New York to kind of present them anew and let people sing them. I've done works with soundtracks for Jewish museums in Moscow and Warsaw, using old sound recordings, and then, as was mentioned in the kind introduction, I've been involved with a concert series in Washington, D.C. with the Pro Musica Hebraica Foundation, which for 10 years put on concert hall performances of the same type of music we're familiar with here, but with a specific focus on forgotten Jewish art music. Now, what struck me when I was thinking about this conference today was that range of activities and what links them all. And I think what links them all, and all of our endeavors, I would posit, is that there's an underlying meta-theme of loss, and that this is lost music. We call it suppressed or repressed or forgotten or forbidden, but whatever we call it, the reason that we approach it with such curiosity and with such sense of a moral imperative is because there's been a rupture, right? Something has been lost. And it's the lostness of this music, I would argue, which is what lends it its appeal. But if it's lost, then that also means we have a role. We're the finders. We, the scholars, the artists, and the audience, we get to perform this kind of magical, conjuring act of recovery. We get to outwit history, right? That's the title of a book by Aaron Landis, the founder of the National Yiddish Book Center, has. Or we get to redeem the past, right? And this very overused cliche about redeeming the past. So I want to ask, what is lost music? What makes it lost? Because lost, of course, is a very ambiguous word, as is all the other words we use: recovered, suppressed, silenced. These are shorthands, of course, just like, as we heard, Holocaust music is, and just as, in fact, Jewish music is. And they're terms that conceal as much as they reveal. They're also, I think, very rushed, impatient, and even lazy phrases. And lazy and impatient are the words I would use to characterize it, and they're going to sort of be the theme of the rest of my remarks. Because when I think about this impulse to go back and retrieve something, I think about that story by Kafka, but I also think about something else that Kafka wrote. So I'm going to read a short quote from him in his aphorisms. There, Kafka has a famous line in which he says, "There are two cardinal sins from which all the others spring: impatience and laziness. Because of impatience, we were driven out of paradise. Because of laziness, we cannot return." So I think Kafka pinpoints our sense of loss. We've been driven out of paradise. We've lost something. History is not what it should be, right? That's a theme we come back to again and again. These composers do not receive what they deserved. Their music was violated. Music was violated. Something is absent. And I think this is something that we feel instinctively. And Kafka pinpoints that sense of driven out of paradise, but also provocatively says that we're sinners, right? That our impatience and our laziness have cost us, and they still cost us in the pursuit of redemption. So I want to, with that meta theme out there, I want to talk about this now with 4 examples that are drawn from my own experience, get confessional, but roughly over the past decade in thinking about this, where these ideas of impatience and laziness really have hit me in the face when I have been doing this work and doing what all of us here are doing, which is approaching the past. And I don't do this to moralize, right? I would say that it's interesting to note we're in the midst of this 10-day period, Asra Yemei Tshuva, the 10 days of repentance between the holiday of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And it's a time to reflect on our motivations. But my aim here is not to practice a Jewish-style self-flagellation, but to use Kafka to help all of us, Jews and non-Jews, engage our own deeper motives and our own hidden desires as we perform and listen to this music. So let me start with the first example, and I call this the Schindler's List problem. The very first concert that I worked on at the Kennedy Center was in 2008, And the goal of this concert was to launch an entirely new concert series devoted to Jewish art music. There was some pushback from different quarters about whether it existed, whether one could do this, and whether it was just going to be an exercise in parochial filial piety or something like that. So the goal of the first concert really was to make a splash and to say there's something there, right? And not working with the framework of World War II per se or the Holocaust, but just saying this is forgotten music, right? Lost music. This was built around my scholarly interest, which was Russian Jewish composers from the early 20th century. But the Kennedy Center management was very concerned that a program of obscure composers, however many Washington dignitaries we could bring to the hall, would just not sell. So we added a piece by Osvaldo Golachov, everyone's favorite contemporary multicultural Jewish composer. And the concert went pretty well in presenting, I would say, a diversity of East European Jewish music, because that's also what Golachov is an extension of that. And the high point of the concert was supposed to be when we trotted out our big name, who was Itzhak Perlman. And Perlman closed the concert with a rendition of a 1911 work, Eli Zion, a piece written by Leo Zeitlin, a Russian Jewish composer, an arrangement for violin and piano. And he played it, but Perlman had ideas of his own. So after he somewhat dutifully completed playing this piece, he couldn't resist announcing to the audience an unscheduled encore, in his words, a different kind of Jewish music. Then he proceeded to play the most saccharine version of the theme from Schindler's List that you've ever heard. So I cringed, right? And what's interesting to me is why I cringed. I cringed for two reasons. First, Perlman, for all of his greatness and his sort of spiritual magnanimity or largesse, right? He chose to basically upstage what I would call the Jewish musical past with a cinematic fabrication of the present. Zeitlin's piece is tuneful and restrained in a late romantic style. It's stirring, but it's subtle. And that wasn't enough for Perlman, right? John Williams' piece is powerful in its own right, but it's manipulative in its own sentimentality. And I know of no better way to describe it than the line from Noel Coward, which is that it's extraordinary how potent cheap music is. The second reason I cringed was because of the audience reaction. After 2 hours of measured, respectful listening, polite applause, they erupted, right, with incredible enthusiasm and instant standing ovation. And it was obviously for them the thrill of the familiar. And the appeal of the piece beyond that, I believe, is that it fit the most comfortable familiar channel of thinking about the Jewish musical past, which is the Holocaust, right? They knew what to do when they listened to it. It made sense, it was familiar, and it was also connected to that most powerful of media forms, film, right? And so it was a quick and easy emotional transaction. What I grasped then was that it was going to be an uphill battle, right? Because you could bring out the most diverse program of Jewish music, past and present. Remember I mentioned Golachov. We had contemporary, a very interesting, compelling composer, but it would always compete against something else, and it would always be flattened into a narrative of the Jewish musical past, and have to compete against things that most perfectly express that past, even if they were written in the present as imitations of that. In other words, what I think happened at that moment is that Perlman and the audience conspired together and committed Kafka's sin of laziness. It was laziness to do that. Now, the collapse of lost Jewish music into the Holocaust story is a real problem. And it is out of laziness, I believe, but it's also impatience, right? Because if the ultimate payoff in recovering the past is to touch the most sacred and evocative and stirring and painful moments, then all other music, by definition, will always pale in comparison to this. I grasped this problem about the Holocaust in particular soon after in another concert where we were fortunate to bring Simon's group, the Ark Ensemble, to perform the music of Metek Mstislav Weinberg, right? So for that, I put on my amateur marketing hat and I tried to use Google AdWords to promote the event. And this is my second story to share with you, the Google AdWords problem. Google AdWords is an algorithm where you plug in keywords to their search system, and the idea is it will help drive web traffic to your classical music event or any event, and will fuel hits and click-throughs, right? And you could pick as many as you want, and there's a pricing model and so on and so forth. You choose the keywords, and the world, the web, votes its response by what it clicks through. So I naively tried to market Weinberg by plugging in every conceivable keyword I could imagine: Eastern Europe, klezmer, Jewish music, Polish music, Russian music, Soviet Union, Shostakovich, even just Yiddish, yes, Israel, klezmer, you name it. And I did put in Holocaust music. Can you guess the result? Not one of those words produced anything but the tiniest 2 clicks, except Holocaust music, right? It shot upwards like a beam of light. This is what people responded to, and I learned from Google AdWords that it was gonna not just outweigh everything else, but it was the only thing that in that totally unscientific survey produced a strong demonstrable result. So our culture is impatient. We want the reward up front, and the reward comes most concretely through this idea of Holocaust music. Not merely music inflected by totalitarianism, touched by tragedy, or shaped by anti-Semitism. Holocaust, right? So I've always, like many of you, and like we've already heard today, since that time I've wrestled with the double-edged sword when you want to market this music of the Holocaust. Every salesman knows you go with what sells, but music's not only about sales. And the sin of impatience, of wanting to close the deal swiftly, comes at the expense of trusting and nurturing our own capacity to move beyond cliches and to listen more patiently to the past. I began with Kafka's aphorism about this, but I only actually quoted half of it for you because there's a second half in which he says, perhaps there's not 2 sins, there's only one cardinal sin: impatience. Because of impatience, we were driven out of paradise. Because of impatience, we cannot return. So if impatience and laziness are identical, or if laziness is ultimately just a cause of impatience, then these 2 examples I've given you thus far point to the same problem. We shortchange the Jewish musical past for the same reason that we actually do care about it. We need the music to perform something now, right? Some function for us now. And when we identify all 20th century Jewish music with the Holocaust, we are impatient to use it to find meaning in suffering, or to feel like we have played some role in touching and redeeming the past, of returning to paradise. The third example is connected to that, and it's also connected to something that Simon helpfully put up that slide of the Defiant Requiem. I have also criticized it in print as a pretty disturbing exercise in using the past to serve the needs of the present. And I wrote an article about it a few years ago, and I got a nice batch, one of my first batches of hate mail. But the hardest part was not the hate mail, but a letter I got from a woman who said, I have sung in this Defiant Verdi Requiem chorus. I've sung in it many times. I sang in it in Terezin when we went back there. And she said, I'm the daughter of Holocaust survivors. And how can you do this? For me, this is a redemptive act in which I am able to pay homage to my parents and their suffering and the Holocaust, right? So on the one hand, I feel like I'm sure many of you would feel, yes, I respect her private, subjective experience of it. I don't mean to attack her for the meaning she gets out of it. But I also feel that there's something still very disturbing there, and I think that perhaps she is the extreme version of it, which tells us something about all of us, right? So we could say she's a special case. You can't question her motivations. But I don't think that's true. I think her motivations, although they have ethics driving them, also have a certain desire to redeem the past, and she could tell us something about all of us. The bigger problem is why I'm never going to convince her that this is, musically, aesthetically problematic. But I think what I can say is, inside myself also, we all have that impulse to want to transform and redeem the past, and music offers a way to do that. And so we can learn something from even the most egregious exercises in doing it. But the Holocaust also is not our only need today, right? And we're here not because of the Holocaust. We're here to discuss needs and the past in broader terms. For myself, I'm also interested in the fact that there are many people who hunger for a Jewish musical past to serve other needs today. And this brings me to my fourth and final example. And this is what I call the Salomone de Rossi problem. So Salomone de Rossi, you may recall, was a 16th century Italian Jewish composer who wrote some of the first trio sonatas and was basically as important as Monteverdi, I think it can be argued, in the story of Baroque music. But his fame rests, however, with his Hebrew language choral music. And this is music that a friend of mine recently described by saying, it's totally churchy, but in Hebrew. Right? And it's music that, for that reason, some people absolutely love, and some people actually absolutely love to hate. Right? Those who love to hate it have a simple reason for doing so, and that's that it doesn't sound Jewish at all. Right? My most vivid encounter with the Salomone de Rossi problem came not with Salomone de Rossi, but with Evgeny Kissin. And more recently, in a few concerts that I worked on with him at the Kennedy Center and Carnegie Hall. This was a very long process of picking repertoire because Kissin refused for many years to play anything that he considered to be Jewish music because he insisted there really was none to speak of any good quality, right? And Kissin is somebody who is, you may or may not know, passionately devoted to his Jewish heritage. He basically taught himself Yiddish and has released 2 amateur albums of Yiddish poetry declamation. He has strong opinions about Jewish culture and about Israel. But for that reason, he said, I won't play Jewish music, it's just not as good as any of the other great music I play, right? So when he agreed to partner on this concert project, he did it with the caveat, you have to show me something that truly fits the bill, right? And it took a couple years of sending him scores, and he would come back and say, again and again, either this is Jewish, but it's not any good, or this is good, but it's not Jewish. And the music I and others were giving him was music by Russian Jewish composers and some Central European Jewish composers that was explicitly written as folkloric, modernist / late romantic style music that called itself Jewish, that aspired to be Jewish, and so on and so forth. But each time he would say, it's not good enough, you know. Or as he said about Weinberg's just second-rate Shostakovich. So I admired this about Kissin, right? And I admired his demanding standards. But I also wondered whether his insistence that the music had to sound Jewish was not simply a trap, right? It's another form of impatience. For if we assume we know what the Jewish past sounds like, we're only ever going to hear what we already know. In the end, one of the pieces we settled on was Alexander Crane's Suite Dansée, and it's a wonderful modernist reworking of a French Baroque dance suite based instead on klezmer tunes. And Kissin embraced it, but he rejected the last piece, which is to say, he said, I will play 5 out of 6 of the parts of the suite, because 5 out of 6 to him sounded Jewish and sounded, you know, good music. And the 6th, he said, it's no good. Jewish enough, but not musically high quality enough. So I still admire him, and I've said elsewhere that that's the mark of success when you can really get it right. You can get the artifact and the art, right, as we heard so nicely this morning, and you can get them to align. And Kissin was demanding about that. And while I think we could quibble about the narrowness of his definition of what sounds Jewish, I understand he was trying to do the hard work of ultimately balancing those things. But again, in the spirit of my theme today, I've often wondered, based on those conversations, what drove him and what drives him to insist on such a purity of Jewishness, right? And why does he care so much? Why does he feel the impulse that it must be defined in such a specific way? And I think the answer lies in the same impulse that I've described as ultimately driving all of us. We have a thirst for redemption, to find something broken in the past, and in his case it is his own Russian Jewish past, and to recover it, or at least to hold on to it, even for a fleeting moment. So this brings me back to the question of Kafka. Kafka does write about music, and the most explicit place he talks about it is in his story Josephine the Songstress, or the Mouse Folk. It's also one of the places where he talks, it would appear, most directly about Jews. Right? So in this story, Kafka contrasts Josephine, who is a proud, idealistic, talented singer, with her people, the folk, the mouse folk, who are tuneless and amusical. Moreover, she sings, and they don't believe in the power of the music that she sings. The mice folk say, this is quoting Kafka, our lives are hard. Peace and quiet are what we yearn for more than anything. We're used to suffering. We're well acquainted with death. Historians are paralyzed with shock. Their blood runs cold when they contemplate all of the horrors we've been through. Now, Josephine doesn't deny the horrors, but she believes that the music she sings can redeem her people. And Kafka goes on to write, the way that she sees it, Josephine, only her songs can save us from all of the evil inherent in our political and economic reality. And even if those songs cannot dispel all of our misfortune, misery, and sad destiny, at least they give us the strength to bear them. So Josephine believes in redemption through music, but her people do not. And what does Kafka think? We don't really know for sure, because as I'm giving you this version of his story, he's giving us two different approaches to it, right? I mentioned his comment in the beginning of my talk about how he said music left him feeling trapped. The actual quote is this: listening to music by its nature sets a wall around me, leaving me trapped and anything but free. So we could parse this and we could discuss the many Kafkas and all of these things, but I think it makes sense for our purposes if we understand Kafka as saying that he understands music, but he's suspicious of it, because he's suspicious of utopias. He doesn't believe music can redeem the past, and maybe when he sees its power, it only serves to remind him that he's not in the past and he's stuck in the reality he lives in. It can only remind him, I think, in other words, that he is a prisoner of history. Or is he? I began with the story of Kafka and the doll, and as I told you, it's a true story, but I left out one detail, which is that there are actually two different endings to that story, two different versions of how Kafka resolved his dilemma with the little girl. In the first version, I mentioned, he brings her a new doll, and he says, it's the same doll, just changed in appearance, right? But in the other version, Kafka decides to just write one final letter. And in the letter, he writes in the voice of the doll to the little girl, and he tells the little girl, from the doll's perspective, I've grown up, and I've met somebody, and I'm about to be married. So you must understand that I can no longer write you. I must move on with my own adult life, and you'll have to accept that this is our last communication. Surely you'll understand, this is a quote from Kafka, surely you'll understand that we won't be able to see each other again in the future. So in this version of the story, the girl isn't comforted by a myth of a lost object returned, right? The doll truly is lost forever. Instead, she's forced bluntly to accept loss and change, right? The childish fantasy has yielded to an adult reckoning with loss and rupture. So I think we can end by asking which version of the story about Kafka and the doll is true. Does the doll come back changed, or and the same but not the same, or not? To turn Jewish for one more second, in Jewish law, a lost object requires hashavat aveda, right, which is the return to its owner. If you come across a lost object, you have a legal obligation to return it to its owner. And this is not coincidentally how many Jews have thought about musical objects and other objects of the Holocaust and the larger troubled past, right? Lost things need to go back to their place of ownership. But of course, music truly, ultimately doesn't have owners. And the composers we're talking about are all gone, right? So then we can ask, who are we actually returning this music to? In our world, the doll remains, but the girl is gone, and we are Kafka. So I'll close with one final simple question. Which ending for the story do we choose? Thank you.
Kafka went on record with his friend that he really liked the music of Janáček, and that other symphonies and things he found really haughty, and like too high-minded and beyond. What do you think it was about like Janáček's tragic operas, for example, are uniquely tragic? What do you think it was about that element that he might have liked, or that we can consider when we were looking at the doll, for example, or other works?
I'm tempted to ask a Czech music specialist. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, I mean, one of the things he liked about it was that, I mean, Brod was Janáček's big champion. So, I mean, obviously, I'm guessing, I don't know a lot of details about this, but a lot of what we've been talking about are the kinds of things that give listeners and audiences a stake in material, even before they've encountered it. And, you know, Broad wrote the first biography of Janacek in 1924. It's sort of an overstatement, but basically, no Broad, no Janacek. You know, he had labored 50 years in the provincial vineyards, and along came Broad after hearing Yenufa first performed, and immediately decided he was going to become Janacek's champion in the world, had it translated into German, supervised the first performances, and it's difficult to imagine another way that Janacek would have made his way internationally. And so he was a propagator and an enthusiast, and I'm sure he filled Kafka up with plenty of stories and excitement about what Janacek was doing.
It makes sense to me. I would add one more thing, which is from an amateurish perspective. It's striking that, if you think about it, it's striking that if we can trust all the sources, because there's another broad problem, which is that he's constantly betraying Kafka, and we don't know, we have to take what Broad says with a grain of salt about what Kafka told him. But from a certain perspective, it would make much more sense that Kafka would like Mahler, not like Janacek, I think, right? We often associate Mahler's like Kafka. It's one of the sick men of the 20th century, right? He's this great alienated soul, alienated from his Jewishness, spiritual yet not religious, all of these different things, right? That these cliches, but they point to some consonances between them. But maybe precisely because of that, Kafka recoiled from it a little bit, because he didn't want this spiritual redemption that Mahler was going for in his symphonies. Maybe he didn't think that was possible. Maybe that's the anti-utopian, anti-messianic side of Kafka. But
not to mention, if he didn't like music all that much, you know, one Mahler symphony...
That could do it.
is long enough to hold all of Janacek's instrumental works and leave room for an opera or two. So
right. The tyranny of form, yeah.
Please, yes.
I was very fascinated by your relaying to us the John Williams incident with Ziering-Conlon. Is it possible to think of, say, Schindler's List or more popular works that are inspired by this time period as forms of community engagement that could get people who otherwise would not be coming to academic events like this, or that they would become interested more in the more authentic works that you're talking about? Say if someone heard either Schindler's List or Fiddler on the Roof or something, and that sparked their interest in finding out more about the more authentic pieces. Is that Would that be worth it, or is that participating more in the laziness that you're talking about?
Right. Well, that's the dilemma for every classical music programmer in the country, right? Whether you should allow the hip-hop concert before the symphony in order to get people there, or let people, you know, booze it up. I mean, these different things as giving people what they want, or what's familiar and more digestible, in hopes that it will be a gateway to a deeper engagement. And there's a debate, obviously, about whether that's true. I'm a little cynical that that's true, but even if it were true, I think the problem is, and what I'm trying to say is, the problem is that on the way in, you do something to people's perceptions. And on the way in, you set up a dynamic in which this is already out there as the model of what this should sound like. And therefore, if it doesn't sound like John Williams, then it doesn't sound as compelling. And John Williams, of course, to be fair to him, he writes it's a different genre, right? He's writing music for a film context where you are supposed to actually frame and highlight and manipulate the action in a certain way. So that's a whole other conceptual problem. But I think it has a distorting effect that is ultimately harmful. And I also think that people don't make the trip all the way through the portal. And I think as Mike has said and has written, it is a zero-sum game, out there. Like the attention that this gets takes the attention away from this. So that's my reservation about it.
Well, speaking of loss, we all have our sort of personal fantasy golden ages, that are essentially made up. But of course, one of mine academically is a world where there isn't any kind of real constant separation between things we call performance and theory and analysis and musicology and ethnomusicology, that they are really viewed as a unit. I sort of wonder when I hear, even when I hear you speak about an audience, I wonder, how much ethnography is done with an audience, because we easily attribute things to the audience. They like it for this reason, they erupt for that reason. But if we never talk to them, right, then what is it that, we're also in various boxes that way. And is there a way to keep, I absolutely resonate with this idea of laziness for all of us in various aspects of our work. And, is there a way that we can, when we're tempted to attribute something to an audience in terms of their response, find a way to have some kind of dialogue with them that could either confirm it or might suggest other avenues? Mm-hmm.
Sure, we could have clickers, right? No. You're right. I mean, I'm making assumptions too. Yeah, I accept that, and I think it would be really interesting to probe that in more direct and creative ways, as you suggest, so we don't assume we understand why people are doing this, reacting the way they are, right? I mean, there are other ways to tell that story, and one of them is that Perlman is Perlman, right? He is a talented performer and a showman, so he knows what to do with that piece of music to get the most effect out of the audience also. And it's not just because everyone knows this theme. I'm telling it in a certain way, and we could deduce other motivations for audiences. That it's also nice because it's short, right? That these other works are maybe not short enough, So I agree with you. We shouldn't. If I'm going to be harsh about laziness, it should apply to us too, in testing our assumptions. You want to?
Yes, please, sir, and then.
Some might say that the transcendence of the Holocaust is expressed in the birth of a nation, the birth of a new generation, and the restoration of Jewishness in Israel. What's the receptivity in Israel of the recovery of the lost Russian composers or lost Jewish composers?
Well, not surprisingly, the receptivity is strongest among Russian-speaking Israelis, because for them it's a really fascinating multi-layered story of their own past inside 20th century Soviet musical life, where Jews played a huge role, but Jewish music was not foregrounded, with some interesting exceptions. But generally speaking, there's not much traction there. And there is, nor I would say is there, I mean, I'd be interested to hear people talk about this, but Holocaust music and many of the things we're talking about also, I don't think they resonate as deeply there, because they have a different experience of the Holocaust. It's the moment of that is intimately connected with the rebirth, as you mentioned, and with an official establishment that tries to create a new generation of composers. And even as we heard this morning, composers who are really part of Europe have to reinvent themselves there to fit into this new soundscape. So the short answer is there's not as much interest as you might imagine in that. And I think in Israel, there's other things that have become sources of reaching back to the past. The music, religious music, liturgical music, music of Jewish communities from Eastern Europe, but not the music of the concert hall.
One last question, ma'am.
Yeah, this goes back to the Kafka question that you posed at the end, and it's a little gloss on it, because both versions, both alternatives are consolatory. In one, the child gets the doll back. In the other, the child gets to be happy knowing that her beloved doll has gone off to get married, and presumably that's a good ending. Mm-hmm. So there is another ending. It's one that we wouldn't want to tell the child, but it is a genuine one, that I'm gone. Or obviously silence is the other, mm-hmm. but the other is this is difficult, and therefore you must grow up and accept difficulty. And that, again, is not something one can say. On the other hand, it does circle back to what you were talking about right now, which is the acceptance of difficulty as a programmer, as a curator. And I suppose it circles back, and this is more of a comment than a question, but to a culture that perhaps is impatient and is lazy simply with the idea of difficulty and lack of consolation.
Right, right. I hesitate to say anything because I think that's a very eloquent formulation of it, and precise. I think that's true. And what's striking, and this is something maybe we'll have a chance to hear more about in the upcoming talks, is when and where are the points in which difficult texts and difficult pieces of art and art that is difficult appeals more to us, and when are the points at which it appeals less to us, right? There are times when, I mean, even as we heard, I think, from Jeremy Eichler this morning, you know, there's ways in which certain kinds of modernism fit better after the Holocaust to certain types of listeners and expectations than they do before, you know. So that all that type of thing about when we want difficulty and when we don't is an interesting and important thing to reflect on. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.